Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
It started with the sound of silverware against porcelain, that irritating little clink that fills a room when people are pretending everything is fine. My sister was sitting across from me, her face stretched into that artificial smile she wears when she's trying too hard to look gracious. Her husband, Tom, was doing all the talking. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting casually on his wine glass, as if he were negotiating a business deal rather than demanding something obscene. "We just think it would make sense," he said, with that tone of false reasonableness that makes your skin crawl. "You have no kids, no husband, and the house is too big for one person. 5 bedrooms? Come on, it's practically a mansion. It would help Emily's family so much if you signed it over." I looked at him, then at my parents, who both stared down at their plates as though the mashed potatoes might suddenly provide moral guidance. It wasn't even anger I felt at first, just disbelief, this dizzying sense that I had walked into the wrong house, or the wrong version of my own life. "You're asking me to give up my home," I said, slowly, carefully, as though he might not understand English if I said it too fast. Tom smiled, the kind of smile men give when they believe they're the smartest one in the room. "No one's asking you to give it up. Just transfer ownership. It's still in the family." In the family. That phrase landed like a splinter. Because if this family had taught me anything, it was that family was a word people used when they wanted something for nothing. My father finally cleared his throat. "He's right," he muttered. "You've done well for yourself, and your sister has 3 kids. She's struggling. You could help." He didn't even look up while saying it, as though my life and everything I'd worked for were some line item on a balance sheet. My mother nodded weakly beside him, her eyes darting between us, already surrendering before a real argument even began. I could have laughed, but instead I felt this slow, heavy calm descend on me. "And what exactly do I get?" I asked, not because I wanted an answer, but because I wanted to hear how ridiculous it would sound when they said it out loud. My sister opened her mouth, but Tom beat her to it. "You get peace," he said, smirking. "You get to do the right thing." That was when I realized this wasn't about fairness or generosity. This was about control. He had turned my parents into silent accomplices, my sister into a puppet, and me into the villain who refused to help family. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until I finally said, "Funny, you're fighting so hard for someone who isn't even your blood." It came out before I could stop myself. My father's fork froze halfway to his mouth. My mother's hand trembled slightly, the wine in her glass rippling. Tom blinked, a fraction of confusion passing over his smug expression. And my sister, dear, fragile Emily, just sat there, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. She looked like a person who'd been caught in a lie she didn't know she was telling. The table went silent. The hum of the refrigerator in the background suddenly sounded deafening. I didn't explain myself. I stood up, placed my napkin gently on the table, and said, "Dinner was lovely." Then I walked out before anyone could find the courage to speak. That night, the house felt colder than usual. I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, staring at the dark outline of the 5 bedrooms Tom said were too many for one person. I had worked for every inch of this place. I paid the mortgage alone, repaired the roof myself when a storm ripped half of it off, and replaced the ancient plumbing one frozen winter weekend. My parents hadn't lifted a finger. Emily hadn't even visited until the day after Mom's funeral, when she stood in the living room, pretending to admire the crown molding while her eyes measured the square footage. I thought about calling her that night, maybe even apologizing for that last line, "Isn't even your blood," but something in me resisted. There had been something strange in my mother's reaction, that flicker of guilt that didn't belong to a woman merely caught in a family argument. It felt deeper, heavier. The kind of guilt that has roots. Unable to sleep, I went to the attic to look for distraction, old photo albums, childhood junk, anything that reminded me that once this house had meant warmth. I found a small wooden box marked "Mom, Private." It was tucked behind a stack of faded Christmas decorations, dust coating the lid like time's way of saying, "You're not supposed to open this." But I did. Inside were envelopes tied with a thin ribbon, and on top, a smaller one with my mother's handwriting. It said, "For her eyes only." My heart dropped. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Emily. I held it under the lamplight for a long time, tracing the loops of my mother's neat cursive. It wasn't just curiosity that made my hands shake. It was the dread of realizing that maybe my careless words at dinner hadn't been as careless as I thought. I opened the envelope and pulled out a folded letter, along with a photograph, my mother in a hospital gown, cradling a newborn. Only the date in the corner didn't match Emily's birth certificate, and the baby's features were unfamiliar. Different eyes, darker skin, a strange resemblance to no one in our family. I sat there until the drink in my hand turned warm, the clock ticking into the small hours. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. My mother's letter began simply, "If you're reading this, then you've found the truth I couldn't say aloud." The rest of the words blurred as my eyes filled. I didn't finish it, not yet. Because for the first time that night, I realized this wasn't about a house at all. It was about everything that had been built on a lie, and I wasn't sure how much of it I wanted to see before it all came crashing down. By morning, the air in the house felt stale, the kind of stale that comes from secrets left open on a table overnight, and while the coffee sputtered and hissed like it wanted to be anywhere but my kitchen, I unfolded the letter I had put down at 2 a.m. and let my mother's voice walk me through a hallway I apparently had been living beside my entire life without noticing the locked door at the end. She wrote in that careful schoolteacher script she never lost, saying that grief does not ask permission, and sometimes it pushes people into decisions they would never make in daylight, and that after a winter that took more than it gave, there had been a baby, not hers in the way that blood decides, but hers in the way a woman with a broken heart chooses to breathe again. She did not name names, which is such a mother thing to do, as if protection could still be managed from the grave, but she wrote about the day the nurse looked past her like she was a visitor rather than the patient, and how my father held the bundled child as if the careful way you hold something can turn a lie into a promise, and there was a line that stopped my breath because it was so naked I could almost hear her voice cracking as she wrote it. She said, "I lied because I wanted a future, and every future I could see had her in it." I set the paper down and studied the photograph again, not the baby first, because babies can look like anyone and no one at the same time, but the wristband on my mother's arm and the hospital logo and the date stamped in the right corner, which, even through the haze of cheap developing ink and years of attic summers, did not line up with the family story that had been told around every Thanksgiving table as if repetition could make a story true, and in that mismatch I felt the floor of the house tilt a few degrees, enough for the furniture of memory to slide just a bit, enough for me to realize my sentence at dinner had not been a reckless jab but a threat, and I had already pulled it. While the coffee cooled into something purely symbolic, my phone began its parade of righteousness. A long message from Tom with bullet points he surely copied from a blog that lets insecure men cosplay as attorneys. A syrupy voice memo from Emily that used the phrase "do the right thing" twice and "for the kids" 3 times, and a curt text from my father that said he expected me at their place that evening to discuss proper arrangements, which made me laugh out loud in that ugly way that turns immediately into something wetter and less controllable. I let them all sit there like flies at a window. Then I opened my laptop and did the thing a woman does when her boundaries are treated like a suggestion, which is to make them structural. I filed the homestead protections my accountant had nagged me about for years. I moved the deed into a simple living trust with my own ridiculous middle school nickname as the trust name, because if I was going to be the villain in someone else's bedtime story, I could at least amuse myself while signing papers, and I arranged for a polite, impeccably formatted cease and desist to land on Tom's desk before lunch, drafted by a very real attorney who owed me a favor and who enjoys, perhaps more than he should, serving harassers in conference rooms where their colleagues can witness humility arrive in a blue folder. Then I walked the perimeter of my house in a sweater I bought during a winter where money was a rumor, checked the motion lights, photographed the locks for the file my lawyer told me to keep, and printed out a neatly worded notice revoking any informal family access, which I taped inside the mudroom where only someone already inside would see it, a petty little flourish that I will not apologize for because sometimes petty is just justice with good penmanship. By the time the process server texted me a photograph of Tom receiving the letter with that tight, red face men get when they are being told no in public. I had already packed a tote bag with a clean notebook, a pen that writes like a secret told in confidence, and the wooden box from the attic, because if I was going to be accused of cruelty, I might as well be thorough. The county clerk's office still smells like books even though it is all scanners and terminals now, and the woman at the window had that brisk kindness that tells you she has seen every shape of panic and will not be unkind to yours. I gave her the dates from the photograph and from the family stories, and I watched her eyes flick across the screen in that way that makes you realize how much of your life can be reduced to lines of text if someone decides to look closely enough, and after a minute that became a lifetime, she printed 2 forms and slid them to me without fanfare, saying quietly that records can be messy, but paper does not forget. On the first was the admission date matching the photograph and a discharge summary signed by a doctor whose name I recognized from our town's old practice, and on the second, where a box labeled biological mother waited to be filled by someone with more faith in ink than truth, there was a name I had never seen in our family tree, a name ordinary enough to feel real and heavy enough to bend the air between the two of us, Lydia Hart. I carried that name out of the building as if it might evaporate if I walked too fast, and while I sat in my car letting the heater exhale on my fingers, I thought about all the small, unremarkable moments that suddenly looked staged. My mother's reluctance to be photographed at certain ages of Emily's babyhood, my father's violent generosity when anyone suggested my sister should carry her own weight, the way he once shouted at a cousin for joking that Emily had different eyes like a storm had blown in through the window and knocked the plates off the table. I was not sure yet what I meant to do with the name beyond writing it down on the first page of the new notebook in letters large enough to make my hand ache. But I knew the next move had to be mine, and it had to be clean, because the only thing uglier than a family lie is a clumsy attempt to expose it. So I drove home with the box on the passenger seat like a silent co-conspirator, and before I put the car in park, my phone lit up with a photograph my attorney had forwarded. The timestamp right on top of Tom's stricken expression as he stood in his glass-walled meeting room holding the cease and desist like it might bite him, and I allowed myself a quiet, unspectacular smile that tasted like the first sip of something expensive someone else has to pay for, because a small revenge, properly timed, is not pettiness, it is punctuation, and it had landed exactly where it needed to. I set the letter and the county printouts on the kitchen counter, pulled the envelope addressed to Emily from the wooden box again, and as I slid the photograph back into its sleeve, the house phone, yes, the stubborn landline I kept because automatic systems hate it, began to ring with the old-fashioned insistence of bad news trying to be polite, and when I answered, my father did not say hello. He inhaled like a swimmer about to admit the water is cold and said, "Whatever you think you found, you do not understand what your mother made me do," and before I could ask him what he meant, the line clicked, and the dial tone washed over the kitchen like a dare. My father's voice lingered in the kitchen long after the dial tone flattened it, and while the clock on the stove marched forward like an accomplice with no conscience, I gathered the letter, the photograph, and the clerk's printouts into a single stack that felt heavier than paper has any right to feel, because once you have dates and signatures, you do not have a family story anymore, you have evidence. And evidence has a cruel way of refusing to be soothed by excuses or nostalgia. I drove to my parents' house not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I wanted him to look at the forms and say the words out loud, and when he opened the door with that stunned, sleepless expression men get when the dam finally cracks, I realized he had been rehearsing a confession for years and was only now discovering that practice does not make it gentle. He did not sit, and neither did I, because some truths prefer you on your feet. He stared at the photocopied admission sheet, at the discharge summary, at the field where biological mother had been typed with ruthless neatness, and he said that one winter took everything from them, and a cousin's cousin, which is how rural people distance scandal without changing blood, had a newborn no one was going to claim, and your mother decided she would claim her, and I decided I would let her, and then we told the story so many times it became furniture, and we taught you to dust around it. He kept talking, because once a man starts to explain the decision that rerouted his soul, he cannot stop mid-sentence, and he said there had been a name on an envelope at the time, a Lydia Hart who had wanted a clean ledger and a quiet town. And that money moved as quietly as a confession at dusk, and he had signed papers he did not truly read because grief had him by the throat, and he begged me not to torch what was left, which would have been moving if I had not spent years being told to set myself on fire to keep everyone else warm. I asked him whether Emily knew, and his shoulders lifted and dropped like a man shrugging off the last of his authority. He said my mother could never bring herself to say the sentence out loud. That she loved Emily ferociously and with a kind of superstitious fear that made fairness look like a threat, and that he had covered every silence with money until money felt like penance rather than power. He reached into the drawer where receipts go to die and produced a safe deposit key taped to an index card in my mother's handwriting, and he said there was another envelope with my name on it in box 34 at First Union, and he asked me to read that one before I did anything permanent, as if permanence were a moral failure rather than a necessity when people refuse to hear you. I left him standing in a kitchen that suddenly looked like a set between scenes and drove to the bank, because I know how quickly frightened men call other frightened men when they smell the word truth. And while I waited for the box to be brought to the little private room with its scratched table and its chair that forces you to sit upright, I searched the public marriage index from my phone, because sometimes answers are not hidden at all, they are simply never looked for. Within minutes I had Tom's mother's maiden name, and there it was, clean and undeniable, a Hart, which means my brother-in-law was not simply a husband fighting for his wife's comfort. He was a man defending his own bloodline under the banner of mine. And if I had not already swallowed the last of my patience, that would have done it. The teller set the metal box down with that ceremonial clank designed to make you feel the weight of what you are about to know, and inside, beneath life insurance duplicates and a flattened corsage I could not place, there was a thick envelope addressed to me in my mother's steady script, sealed with a strip of tape as if force could improve courage. The letter inside did not bother with preamble. It described an arrangement made through Lydia. It referenced a pastor who agreed to a christening that smudged dates like a thumb across wet ink, and it closed with a line that burned even as it tried to fold itself into mercy, the sentence where she said she had given Emily her name because she could not give her face. I walked out of that room with a new kind of quiet inside me, the quiet of a verdict, and back in my car I let the engine idle while I assembled the day's second act, because every episode of this farce would end with a small, exact correction of the record. And today's correction would be administrative rather than theatrical. I called my attorney and asked him to file an affidavit of ownership with a request for a recorder's fraud alert, to circulate copies to every title insurer in the county, and to prepare a slander of title notice addressed separately to Tom and to Emily. Each letter politely warning that any further attempt to coerce a transfer would be treated as intentional interference and reported without hesitation. I also dictated a short, factual note to Tom's company's compliance office, because you do not threaten a deed and then hide behind a cubicle, and while I am not in the habit of weaponizing employment, I am also not in the habit of letting men audition as my warden without consequences measured in something other than my goodwill. By the time I turned into my driveway, the confirmations were already arriving like little metallic birds dropping receipts onto my phone, and the porch light, set on a timer I never bothered to change, clicked on with comic punctuality as if to underline that the universe enjoys punchlines, and I stood on the front step with the bank envelope pressed against my ribs and listened to the one sound that can still make a grown woman feel like a child, the low murmur of two familiar voices on the other side of the door arguing in undertones about whether to knock or to use their old key, a key they no longer possessed because I had quietly changed the locks 2 nights after the funeral. And when I opened it, my father looked at the envelope and said a name I had already learned to write without shaking, while Tom, standing far enough back to pretend he had no part in this, smiled with the soft malice of a man who believes he has an angle I have not yet accounted for, and somewhere down the street a siren lifted and fell like a curtain. Tom stayed on the porch with that careful distance men adopt when they want to look uninvolved while directing traffic with their eyes, and my father, who had never looked small in his own life even when grief hollowed him out, stared at the bank envelope like it might turn to ash if he could summon enough remorse, and I realized that the room between us had stopped being a living room years ago and had slowly, politely become an evidence locker where every holiday, every forced apology, every "be nice to your sister" lecture had been catalogued and shelved under a label we all agreed not to read. He asked me, with a voice that carried the kind of exhaustion that makes people confuse surrender with virtue, to sit, and he stood instead, because he could not confess while relaxed. And he told me the winter I barely remember had taken a child from my mother and had taken his judgment with it, that the cousin's cousin who became a rumor had also become a lifeline no one wanted to name, and that the hospital records were not wrong so much as the story we told afterward had been aggressively edited to make cowardice look like mercy. And while he spoke, Tom watched my face for any tremor he could interpret as leverage, which was almost funny. Because the one thing this entire circus had taught me was to hold still until it was time to move. I asked whether Emily had any suspicion, not because I feared her reaction, but because I needed to decide if what I was about to do would be an earthquake or simply the formal recognition that the house had already cracked down the middle. And my father said that your mother wanted to tell her a dozen times and never could, that every time she tried she turned it into a chore list or a shopping errand, and that he, who has always believed logistics are a cure for emotion, kept paying for things as if invoices could muffle the truth, and when I pressed, he admitted the christening was arranged with a friendly pastor who backdated, that a notarized affidavit with clarified dates still existed somewhere, and that the name Lydia Hart had drifted through the house like a smell no one could place and everyone learned to ignore, and this confession would have earned a kind of sympathy if he had not followed it with the request that I keep the lie intact for the sake of peace, which made me think about how peace, in this family, has always meant my silence while other people rearranged my life and called it compromise. Before Tom could wade in with his calm cobra voice, I put the safe deposit letter on the coffee table and told my father I would not burn the house down, that I would not publish anything, that I would not post a triumphant timeline or weaponize nostalgia, and that I would not humiliate Emily even if she had earned a polite reckoning. What I would do, I said, was set the truth in the center of the table and let each person choose whether to look at it, and if someone decided to flip the table, that would be their hands and not mine, and he closed his eyes because he knew that sounded like fairness and felt like judgment, and maybe it was both. Tom finally spoke, leaning on a tone that said he enjoyed being the adult in other people's houses, and he suggested, with the confidence of a man who has never had to consider that he might be the least informed person in the room, that we pause all this drama, bring a neutral notary to the anniversary dinner, and resolve things cleanly. Which almost made me clap, because I enjoy a straight line to the finish when people think they are designing a maze for me. That afternoon, while my father retreated to the kitchen to argue with his conscience over a glass of tap water, I sat on the front steps and dialed a number I had found by starting with nothing more than a name and a county and the knowledge that secrets are rarely clever, and when a woman answered with a voice like unvarnished wood and simply said hello without adding her name, I introduced myself with mine and let silence do the work it does when the past arrives without warning. Lydia did not hang up, which told me she was not surprised to hear from the shape of her past, and she did not pretend confusion, which told me she had been waiting for this call longer than I had been alive in a way that matters. And when I told her there would be a family dinner on Saturday to finalize paperwork everyone pretended not to have already filled out in their heads, she asked me whether there would be wine, which made me smile because women who have survived their own choices tend to keep social courage in the cupboard next to the good glasses, and I told her there would be more than enough, and I invited her to come as an old friend of my mother who wanted to pay respects, and she said she had a dress that could pass for nostalgia and a spine that could pass for etiquette, and that would have to do. I went home and turned my day into tasks, because fear surrenders quickly to a checklist if you let it, and I messaged the restaurant to confirm a private room and to request that all checks be separated with the kind of pettiness that reads as civility. And I sent my attorney a short update with a single new instruction that tasted like metal even as it went down smoothly, which was to place a call to Tom's firm's ethics hotline with a concise report that a senior analyst had used his title to threaten a coerced transfer of a private residence, including screenshots of messages where he wrote things like, "My compliance folks say this is standard," which is not only not standard, it is stupid in writing. I did not need anyone fired. Which I said out loud to my empty kitchen like a spell against overreach, but I did need him preoccupied and reminded that he did not get to play sheriff in my town without getting measured by a badge he did not own, and by early evening he had been invited to a cheerful, mandatory meeting with the head of compliance on Monday morning, which is the corporate version of a teacher closing the classroom door and writing your full name on the board. As dusk finally settled over the roofline I have repainted twice with my own money and my own mildly reckless latter decisions, I laid the photograph, the notarized christening record from the safe deposit box, and the county printouts in a thin folder that would slide easily into my purse without wrinkling, and I tucked a small DNA kit, ordered for a different kind of curiosity months ago and never used, into the gift bag Emily insisted I bring for our parents, because nothing says family like wrapping paper around a dare. And when the house phone rang again, my father sounded older but lighter, as if speaking the secret had finally allowed him to breathe in his own kitchen, and he asked me not to be cruel, and I told him I have never been cruel. I have been accurate, and if accuracy hurts, that is because lies have tender skin. When we ended the call, I stood at the window and watched the motion light trigger as a neighborhood cat slunk across the driveway, and I let myself imagine for one careful minute that Saturday would end with apologies and perspective and a soft landing. Then I folded that minute into the drawer with the takeout menus, because if this family has taught me anything, it is that hope is allowed, but only after the locksmith. And because every chapter of this ridiculous opera requires a small, personal act that resets the balance in increments you can measure without bravado, I scheduled a donation to the women's legal clinic my mother once volunteered for. A quiet sum in Emily's name that would pay for exactly one consultation each month for a year, a gesture petty enough to make me grin and principled enough to make me stand up straighter, and I clicked confirm with the same steady finger I would use to open my purse at dinner and place the photograph on the linen tablecloth, not like a grenade thrown to make a point, but like a place setting laid for the only guest we had pretended not to invite. The restaurant had that careful hush expensive places cultivate, a rehearsal room quiet where everything from the linen to the water glasses suggests civility will be observed even if the reason for gathering is shaped like a blade. And as the waiter swept away the extra place settings I had requested on purpose, because absence looks louder when a chair stands ready, Emily tapped her phone as if notifications could organize her nerves. My father rotated his wedding band in small circles like penance you can do with your hands, and Tom aligned the stack of papers he had brought with the edge of the table as though geometry could convert greed into order. He began with a speech that might have sounded reasonable if we had all been struck suddenly and simultaneously with amnesia, a list of practicalities about square footage and children's needs and keeping assets in the family. And when he slid the top document toward me with the flourish of a man convinced he is offering a gift wrapped in responsibility, I looked at him without picking up the pen and said the sentence I had not been able to swallow since he practiced this move in my parents' dining room, that line about fighting so hard for someone who isn't even his blood. And the silence that settled then was not awkwardness or offense or surprise, it was the silence of furniture realizing it has been called on as a witness. I did not dramatize the next movement, because theater would have cheapened the point, so I opened my purse, drew out the thin folder I had assembled like a blueprint for a bridge I intended to burn with precision, and placed on the linen the photograph from the hospital with the stamped date that never fit the origin story, the county printouts the clerk had handed me with the gaze of a woman who knows paper will tell on us when we cannot, and the notarized christening record from the safe deposit box where my mother had hidden courage under tape, and while my father's face moved through decades in a handful of seconds, I gestured to the doorway and the hostess, who had been waiting for my signal with the professional indifference of someone accustomed to birthdays and divorces unfolding at the same table, guided in a woman in a dark blue dress that did not beg attention yet carried it like a candle. And I introduced Lydia as an old friend of my mother's who had come to pay respects. Which was true enough, because respect for the truth had been a long time coming and deserved witnesses who knew where it was buried. Lydia did not sit immediately, because she understood something my family has never learned, which is that posture can do more than words. And she rested one hand lightly on the back of the open chair while she looked at my father the way people look at maps they drew by memory and haven't consulted in years. And then she met Emily's eyes and said, in a voice so steady it seemed to iron the tablecloth, that once there had been a winter and a hurried favor and a pastor who mistook compassion for paperwork, and that she had never asked for anything because asking would have made what happened a transaction rather than a trespass, and she apologized not for the existence of Emily, which would have been a cruelty unworthy of the woman standing there, but for the way adults had tried to make a secret do the work of love, which it cannot do because secrets are scaffolding, not walls. My father put both palms flat on the table, a gesture I had seen exactly twice in my life, once at a graveside and once when he told me he had co-signed a loan I would be responsible for if the business failed, and he said the words out loud that I had come for, that Emily had been chosen and named and folded into a story that forgot to tell the truth, and that he had been afraid for so long he no longer recognized the difference between peace and silence. Tom tried to regain the narrative because men like Tom cannot breathe if they are not narrating. And he said something about how all this was irrelevant from a legal standpoint and how a fair-minded person would still sign given the needs of children and the history of the house, and before he could push the papers toward me again, the waiter arrived with my small, tailored interruption, a modest leather folder bearing the bill split into separate checks as requested and tucked beneath mine. Like a polite afterthought, a business card and a one-page affidavit my attorney had prepared for exactly this moment, a simple declaration that the property in question was not for sale, not under duress, not subject to transfer, accompanied by a notarization arranged to take place at the bar in 5 minutes if anyone needed ceremony to accept reality, and while Tom processed the fact that the room would not conform to his physics, my phone lit on the table with the bright, impersonal language of an email from a compliance officer confirming a meeting for Monday morning to discuss concerns regarding the misuse of corporate authority in private matters, which I did not read aloud because humiliation is a spice and must be used sparingly if you want its flavor to linger. I slid across the table the small gift bag Emily had insisted I bring for our parents, and when she pulled back the tissue and saw the tidy white box with the swab kit that has become the 21st century's favorite mirror, she exhaled a laugh that was half sob and half refusal to be cornered, and I told her with a calm I had not felt until it was already there that no one would be compelled to do anything tonight, that the kit was not a trap but a door, and that whether she opened it now or never would not change the ownership of my house, only the story she told herself about the people seated at this table and the lengths they had gone to make love look like a ledger. My father reached for her hand and then stopped because habit yields to shame with surprising speed once air touches it, and Lydia, who had taken the empty chair without asking permission from anyone, watched the two of them with the resigned tenderness of someone who knows decisions are rarely improved by audiences and still chooses to stay because absence can be misread as abandonment. I signed my own affidavit, thanked the waiter for the privacy, and gathered my folder without rushing, and before I stood I said the only terms I intend to live by going forward. That the house would remain in the trust with a contingent gift to the clinic where my mother once volunteered because she believed in second chances even when she did not trust herself with first truths. That my door would not be a revolving charity, but it would not be bolted against compassion either, and that if Emily wanted help, the kind you can measure in schedules and budgets and not in apologies, she could ask without using Tom as a microphone, and I would listen, not because guilt demands it, but because blood never did. When I reached the doorway, my father called my name with that old instinct that once made me turn no matter how angry I was, and I paused long enough to hear him say he was sorry in a voice that told me he had finally decided sorrow was less expensive than pretending, and I nodded. Because forgiveness is a currency I spend carefully and sometimes silently. Outside, The evening had the kind of soft darkness that makes reflections look like other rooms you could walk into if you wanted to start over. And as I crossed the parking lot, I saw in the glass the outline of a woman holding a folder whose contents could blow up a life, and choosing instead to let them illuminate it inch by inch. And in that moment, I understood that revenge, when it is done correctly, is indistinguishable from restoration to the person who executes it, because what I had set in motion was not a fire but a boundary, and boundaries do not burn, they hold. Whether Emily opened the kit that night or tucked it into a drawer and declared the story finished is an answer I can live without, because the house is quiet when I unlock it. The motion light performs its small, faithful theater on cue. And on my kitchen counter the folder lies flat, closed, and patient, not a threat, not a trophy, just the truth placed exactly where it belongs, which, as it turns out, is not on a table at all, but on a line no one will step over again.